Well, welcome to another episode of Gallagher's World. Dennis, good to see you this morning.
Great to be here with you.
And today I'd like to talk about something that, as a Jewish person in America, is very near and dear to my heart, which is your relationship with the Jewish community. And it's always been, I think, surprising to people just how good a relationship and how tight a relationship you have had with the Jewish community in Denver and nationally and internationally. I always laugh that at my wedding, the only person who was wearing a yarmulke was you. And of course it was a Kelly green, Irish green yarmulke. But I guess let's just dive into it this morning and tell me how this relationship with the Jewish community and Jews in general really started with you.
Well, Clay, I'm happy to tell you the story, and it's been a great blessing for me in my public and political life that afforded me this blessing to be able to become close to the Jewish community in Denver. And I want to say that the start of it was my grandmother, Nora O'Donovan, who, when she came to Denver in 1915, 2 years before my mother was born, I used to hear my mother and my grandmother talking because she came up to our house every day and visited. She would walk up from where she lived and at 38th and Osceola, and she would walk up to 43rd and Quitman, not far away, and spend the day with my mother. And there she is right there on the left of the picture with her friend Kitty Sweeney. They both worked as domestics in East Side Denver families, housekeepers. And they would have a little banter back and forth. Who did you like working for the best? And my grandmother would always say, I liked working for the Jewish people because they let me go to church on Sunday. So it started off there that I began hearing about these people who let my grandmother, my beautiful Irish Corkonian grandmother, go to church on Sunday. A lot of the non-Catholic house owners did not want her going off to that papist church and getting all that propaganda. So that's how I got my start. I knew that the Jewish people were something special.
So Dennis, you obviously grew up in North Denver, and Denver had a very strong West Side community off of Colfax. And so how did those two, your childhood in that community, come together?
Yes, Clay, I grew up at 43rd and Quitman, and I would ride my bike to Holy Family School at 43rd and Utica. And there was always an older gentleman out taking care of his property and his apartments and his stores at 43rd and Tennyson. And we got to be great friends. We would talk about, I'd stop my bike and on my way home, and he'd talk about Schopenhauer and how he grew up in Odessa, Russia, and the troubles he had. And then he worked for Fred Bonfils at the Denver Post as circulation manager. And his name was Abraham Benjamin. And he was, I found out years later, he was Arthur Goldberg's wife's uncle, a small shtetl right here in North Denver. And he told me about his growing up in Russia and how he went to the yeshiva. And he said that the rabbi was showing them a knife that was used for kosher lamb kills, I guess you'd call it. And that the knife had to be perfectly straight. It couldn't have any dents in it. And so one day he looked at this knife under the magnifying glass and he told the rabbi, "Rabbi, there are dents in this knife." And the rabbi gave him a cuff on the ear, and that sort of pretty well squashed his interest in pursuing debate with the rabbi anymore about the and he had the most wonderful analytical mind. He would look at all kinds of different issues from different things, And one of the things that was so interesting is in the 1960s, when my first political activity was trying to get people to vote for John F. Kennedy, we had a conversation, I remember, that actually said the effect that, well, if an Irish guy like Kennedy can take down the No Irish Catholic Need Apply signs on the White House, who knows? Maybe there's a day when there'll be a Jewish person in the White House.
Well, still waiting for that.
That's right. I know we're waiting for a lot of things. Huh?
That's right. So Dennis, how did your relationship with the West Side community beyond your neighbor, how did that start to come together?
Well, Clay, that's a very interesting story. And when I first got elected to the House in North Denver, it included all the way down to about 6th Avenue, and it included the number of people who were still on the West Side in the Jewish community. And I can't remember who invited me, but someone invited me to Rabbi Manuel Lederman's monthly book reviews. He used to do these wonderful book reviews at the Hebrew Education Alliance, and there had to be 500 or 600 people that would show up for these on a Sunday morning. And here I had the privilege of coming and listening to these book reviews. And I'll never forget when one time he reviewed a book by Simon Wiesenthal called The Sunflower, which is a wonderful story, probably autobiographical, of a Holocaust survivor who was working on a slave gang in his hometown in Galicia. And a nurse comes out of a hospital and says, there's a man in here who wants a Jewish person to talk to him. So can you come in and talk to him? And apparently this was a soldier who had been wounded and burned, who was feeling guilty for having killed a whole village of Jewish people in this area. And he said, will you forgive me? And Wiesenthal then lists his wonderful story where in Jewish tradition you can forgive somebody who did something to you, but not to somebody else. And so years later, I would invite Rabbi Manuel Lederman to come and give a talk, that same talk, at Regis University when I taught. And the topic always got around to forgiveness. What do you do when somebody does something horrible? Can you then forgive them? And Rabbi Lederman repeated Simon Wiesenthal's thesis: you can't forgive somebody for someone else. You can only forgive something that's done to you personally. And the students just revered him and loved him very much. And so it was there at these wonderful book reviews where I got to know a lot of the people, not only on the east side of town, but especially on the west side of town, who always came to hear Rabbi Lederman, who was the chief rabbi there at the Hebrew Education Alliance, the rabbi, and who was so active in the neighborhood, worked for the Denver Symphony, worked at Colorado General to make sure the health system knew the whole history of Jewish Consumptive Relief Society, JCRS Shopping Center out there in Lakewood, and Golda Meir and the whole thing. And so that was the beginning of my relationship with the wonderful West Side Jewish community, of which there are still quite a few people living there. But I'll never forget, I realized when I would go to events on the West Side that many people wore the yarmulke. And so I said to myself, I, as a courtesy to this community, will wear a yarmulke. And I actually was given that bright green yarmulke that you talked about by Ben Briscoe, who was then the Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin, when I hosted him in Denver, and they had a fundraiser for the Dublin Concert Hall. They needed a pipe organ, and they had a luncheon at a downtown hotel. And here's the Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin, and I took him around. I introduced him to everybody. He had the most beautiful Dublin accent. And his father before him Robert Briscoe was Lord Mayor of Dublin as well. Over 30 years, both of them. The Lord Mayor of Dublin voted by council, but it shows you that the Dublin City Council saw a great irony and a great benefit to having in their chief ministerial slot someone of the Jewish faith, because it showed that Ireland was attempting to overcome the notorious anti-Semitic attitudes that we saw so prevalent in Europe in the Second World War and before, centuries before. But anyway, he gave me that yarmulke, and he also gave Rabbi Emanuel Lederman a yarmulke, a similar yarmulke from the Jewish Museum there on the south side of Dublin. And I still have it here, it's somewhere around here. And at that congregation that day, at the lunch that they had, they must have brought in $20,000, which in the 80s was a lot. And they almost paid off the Dublin Concert Hall, the Irish and the Jews of Denver. And Rabbi Lederman points out, well, there's a man here, Robert Briscoe, and then a Jewish name here in Denver, who was named after his father, Ben Briscoe's father, here in Denver, which shows you, this is before Sister Cities and everything, the admiration that the people of Denver had to name one of their children after the Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin, Robert Briscoe, and I can't remember the name of the nice family that did that. But
okay, Dennis. So coming back around to the differences between the East Side and the West Side Jews, and the conservative and the Orthodox and the Reformed Jewish communities in the city. Let's get back into that.
Okay, it became clear to me that there was differences that I had to pay attention to, and I'll never forget it. Phil Milstein's funeral, which was at Temple Emmanuel on the east side of Denver. I was there and I thought, well, I probably should wear my yarmulke as a courtesy. So I wear my yarmulke and I go in, and here's Rabbi Stephen Foster, who was the rabbi of the congregation, and I overheard him say to a group of people who were in attendance at Phil's funeral, they said, oh, that Gallagher, you can tell he's from the West Side, he's wearing his yarmulke. So what do you think about that? And I says to myself, I'm proud to be standing one with Abraham's people, and I'm going to wear my yarmulke whenever I want to. So that was just a little gentle hint from Rabbi Foster that I didn't need to wear the yarmulke at his congregation, even though they were available. I noticed in big, large boxes out in the hall there, in case you wanted to have one. I've always sort of liked having the yarmulke.
I do as well. And I remember when Rabbi Foster started wearing the tallis, the shawls around his shoulders at Temple Emmanuel, when he started doing that, when he became the head rabbi, what a scandal it was for the congregation that all of a sudden we were getting more religious. So it's interesting that he was noting your yarmulke and his congregants were noting his tallis. So
yeah, and so it just was a wonderful education for me.
So Dennis, we live in very interesting times these days. So Dennis, as with everything with Dennis Gallagher, it always at some point in time comes back around to the politics. And so obviously having a big contingent of West Side Jews in your districts certainly brought about a political connection to the Jewish community. But I just want to talk about how the community and you got along politically going forward.
Well, it was a wonderful experience for me to get to know these wonderful committee women who took upon themselves the task of getting everybody registered to vote and then make sure that everybody votes. And I'll never forget Rose Adler, whose family owned the Rustic Inn on West 29th and Sheridan. And the Gallaghers and the Connollys and the Flahertys kept that place going for many years. And my dad always loved that bar, and and Rose Adler and her family always remembered my father coming in there and having a brew or two, and sometimes more.
I was going to say.
And the curse of our tribe. And then also Sarah Singer, a great character from the West Side. She was the committee woman for the West Side. She got everybody in the nursing homes registered to vote. And my first assignment that the Democrats gave me in North Denver was to drive her around to get the absentee ballots. And I don't have much German. I don't have many, but I've got a lot of German words. And it was close enough to the Yiddish that she was using on the recipients of the getting her to notarize their ballots. And it sort of went something like this. Now, again, I cannot be sure, but I think it was, we're not voting for Nixon this year. The rabbis have told us we got to vote for McGovern. And the people would say, no, I don't want, and so I can't say that happened. But again, not being able to translate the Yiddish. And she actually got caught one time voting the graveyard out on West Colfax, and the DA took away her notary. The next time the DA was up, she got her notary back, and she defeated him in the primary, which shows you how Sarah Singer never forgot. And so she lived at 1620 Perry, she made wonderful matzo ball soup. I'll never forget that. She made wonderful matzo ball soup. And then when she was not doing well, she was in the hospital, I went to see her, and she thought that I was her son Gerald, who died in an airplane crash in the Second World War. So here is this wonderful woman who had her ups and downs with the Democratic Party and eventually became a Republican. But, and even I couldn't save her. And, but just characters like that. There's a short story there, don't you think, waiting to be told?
I think there is. And one of the things that I think we see so much of is this new wave of anti-Semitism that has hit the United States, and hate in general. And you're one of the few people in my life that I know who was raised Catholic, has been to any number of different, whether Protestant or Catholic or Christian services, have been to Orthodox, conservative, and Reformed Jewish services, and have gone to services at a mosque. So I guess I wanted to get your impression of these crazy times we live in, and this wave of hate and intolerance that we see so much of right now.
Well, Clay, you're exactly right, and how horrible that we would see the torch-bearing protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, saying a chant, "The Jews shall not replace us." Absolutely unfathomable, and to me, and who we all grew up here in North Denver when the Ku Klux Klan was also very anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, anti-foreign-born, includes all my family and friends. And we had to fight them. I thought we had put them to rest, and we see that it isn't. And in my education as a public official, going to different religious events in the Jewish community, and also in the Muslim community, attending occasionally attending a monthly dinner put on by a group of Muslims from Turkey, who were very much opposed to the secular government of Turkey. And the realization that we are all descended from Abraham and that we all worship the same God is very important. And I think we have to be continually reminded of that. It's a message that cannot be let go. and we have to continue to make sure that we realize what it is to be in the shoes of other believers so that we can fight this terrible, idiotic, irrational, insane anti-Semitism and anti-humanity and pro-hate that's taking over our country. It's just so sad.
So Dennis, I want to come back to that because as a religious scholar, you're talking about something that I understand, and I think lots of people do, but I don't think people really understand the connection of Judaism to Christianity and Christianity to Islam. So can you give us a little bit more depth into that?
Through Abraham and his son Isaac, that the branch of Judaism comes forward, and it's through the other son, Ishmael, that eventually gives us the Muslim faith. And that's why the recent accords that they're trying to get for peace in the Middle East are called the Abrahamic Accords, because all the religions trace their development back to Abraham. And of course, it's through the Jewish people that we get the covenant with Jesus, who in turn then gives us Christianity.
So Dennis, when I was growing up here in Denver, and as I got into politics, one of the biggest issues that was ongoing was the plight of Jews in the Soviet Union, what they referred to back then as Soviet Jewry. And as I got involved in politics, you were always one of the biggest supporters of Jewish causes, not just here in Colorado, but nationally and internationally. And I know that Soviet Jewry was a big issue for you. And so I wanted to get into that and have you sort of talk about how it was in those days and how you got involved in that.
Well, I'm happy to tell that additional blessing that I received in my ongoing education into the Jewish faith through two wonderful women here in Denver, Rhoda Friedman and Lillian Hoffman. And in the early 1970s, they approached me and said, would you be the interfaith chair for what was called the Colorado Committee of Concern for Soviet Jewry? And I said I'd be happy to. And I was a state representative moving to the state senate. And we never dealt with international issues. We could talk about chemigation at the wellhead in the rural areas of Colorado, but never anything so heady and so cutthroat as trying to get the people who wanted to emigrate to Israel out of the Soviet Union and into Israel or other parts of the world. And so I said, I would be pleased to. What does that mean that I'm the interfaith chair? He said, if you can get all the non-Jewish sounding names on the petitions, so get all the Irish names, the Italian names, the Hispanic names, German names, all the legislators, and get them on the list, it will drive the Soviets crazy. And it did. Later, when I had dinner at my house for a group of visiting Soviet agricultural workers, supposedly, and they were all KGB, you could tell just by the way they talked. And
agricultural workers?
They were an agricultural delegation, and how Colorado could get involved in agriculture in the Soviet Union, of which they've always had trouble since collectivization. They never have been able to grow enough food. And in the United States, 4% of the people are on the farms. Can you believe that? And we give enough food for not only the United States, but for a lot of the world too. And it shows you how that system in the Soviet Union was not working. And the cleverness and the insightfulness of these two wonderful women here in Denver. Here in Denver, Colorado, out here in the sticks, the Great American Stock Show, that's our big prize. And yet these women spent time educating the staff members of states, of federal senators, federal representatives, and they knew exactly what the issues were. And so whenever there was a delegation they always expected back east and in Chicago and out west, there would be massive protests. But Denver, Colorado became a linchpin for getting the Soviets to pay attention that they should let the people go. And that's exactly what they did. And whenever there was a Soviet delegation that came to see you for exchange of ideas, we would all be out picketing the University of Colorado. And it was just wonderful to see how this movement blossomed into a wonderful movement. And so I was watching the Jewish channel on TV during the virus, and I see a special on Nathan Sharansky, one of the most famous now Israelis, but then a refusenik in Russia trying to get out. And I remember sending petitions on his behalf. And behind him, in one of the slides, here is a picture of Lillian Hoffman holding a sign, "Let my people go." I think it was only on a few seconds. I couldn't see the whole thing. And she introduced me to Sharansky at a conference in Washington that we all went to. And here I was, a state representative from Denver, from West Denver, from North Denver, being able to meet some of these prominent refuseniks who were leading the way to try to let our people go out of the Soviet Union and the oppression that they faced whenever they tried to find out about their own ancestry and their own religion. I just thought it was very special, and I can't thank Lillian and Rhoda enough.
You know, Dennis, I keep wanting to come back to something, because you've talked about different points in history of things that that brought you closer to the Jewish community. But when I hear you talk about working with the Refuseniks and Soviet Jewry and your connection to these communities, there's an emotional hit that I get off of this. And that's always been one of the things that has really struck me, is that you have an emotional attachment to the Jewish community, that above, I met this person then, or I did this at a later time, that there is something that draws you there. And I guess I'm not sure there's an answer to this question that I'm asking you, but is there? Can you get into sort of that emotional hit on that?
I think it's the emotional tie of meeting people who survived the camps in the Second World War that sort of nudged me closer to the Jewish people. The fact that I met people in Denver, Zeza Starr and Fanny Starr, who were in any number of camps, and she was a kinder transport child to England. And meeting a man in my work through Regis University on training kids to realize that the Holocaust actually happened. And I'll never forget going up to Broomfield to Martin Small's house, where we would bring Regis College students so that they would actually meet someone who experienced this and who actually was a kinder transport recipient and who went to England. His wife, Mrs. Schmall. And I'll never forget one day, he wasn't feeling well, and so I was out there and I was asking him when would be good to bring the students out so they could come and meet with him and hear his story and his wife's story. And he was in his bedroom taking a rest, and then he says, I want to show you something. And he opens up his night desk right by his bed, and he pulls out a 6-shooter. And he says, if the Nazis ever come back, I'm taking 6 of them with me. And I thought, this just shows you how, and he was a survivor of Majdanek, that camp. And an American soldier saw that he was breathing, and he carried him to the infirmary. And years later in New York, he met that Irish policeman who was the soldier who carried him from the dying ward to the living ward, and he survived. I think it's these stories and that have made me feel a kinship to the Jewish people that is something very special, and that's where I get it. Oh, and also I want to point out that Fanny Starr was in several of the camps. She was not, I was getting her mixed up with Doris Small, who was a kinder transport who got to England and never saw her parents again, of course, and suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune in British households by becoming a servant in the British homes during her, but it saved her life, of course, for which she was always grateful. And we just lost her this year as well. So it's a wonderful story that Martin Small lived in New York and would go to Central Park every day, and there was this Irish policeman on the horse, and they got to talking and said, I was in the army, and I was in several of those camps, this officer said. And he said, I was in Majdanek. And he said, well, I was in Majdanek. And an American soldier carried me from the death ward to the hospital ward and saved my life. And he says to Martin, Martin, I was that soldier that carried you from the death ward. And then they became friends forever thereafter. He's still alive in New York. And Martin and Doris, of course, are passed. But can you imagine the strings and threads that life's paths take for people? And I can't get over these stories. They're with me, and they are part of me, and that's why I feel so drawn to the Jewish people.
So Dennis, I know you've received a lot of different honors and awards over the years, and one of the awards you received was for your work with the Refuseniks and on Soviet Jewry. And can you tell us about that?
Yes, Clay, I was honored to receive the first Sakuraf Award presented to me for my work with Soviet Jewry here in Denver in the Colorado Committee of Concern. And I'll never forget, it was presented at a synagogue, and it shows a couple standing for a wedding in Russia. And there's a little Russian town, a shtetl, I guess you'd say, but there's a cathedral in the background, and it shows all these birds flying away from the city and from Russia. And I remember Lillian and Rhoda saying, this is for your work with the Colorado Committee of Concern for Soviet Jewry and for Human Rights in the Soviet Union. And I consider that a wonderful gift that they gave me for enabling me to use my small office as a state representative and a state senator to be able to influence the lives of people in a whole other country. And the artist of that painting is Yevgeny Abashas, who, when they brought him to Denver, the Committee of Concern brought him to Denver. He was living in Israel at the time, had made it out of Russia into Israel, and he stayed in my home. And my grandmother was not feeling well, so she was up with my mother, so he stayed in my grandmother's room. And here's pictures of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph on the wall. And he turned to me and he said, I am so glad you have pictures of our Jewish people on the walls. And I thought that was just so great. And he had such a wonderful time. I said, well, did you ever see anything like this in the Soviet Union? He said, no, you have to pay everybody to go to a parade in the Soviet Union. It looks like everybody here is coming on their own will and having a ball. And that's exactly true, it was. And he, I think he did not become totally Irish, but he became Irish by conviction after that experience of being in the parade. But he's passed on, as have Lillian and Rhoda. And it was a wonderful time that I look back upon, a great time of appreciation that afforded this Irish boy from North Denver to be able to help make the lives of people better in a place called the Soviet Union.
Dennis, we just finished the holy season of Passover, and for my family, Seders are usually measured in minutes rather than hours. But I've always enjoyed the fact that you go to more Seders than I think I've been to in 1 year than I've been to in my life, and they go for a long, long time, and you seem to love that.
Well, I do, and it revives my faith. It adds to my faith and expands my faith when I every year go to a Seder and see the young children growing in wisdom and grace, as Scripture says, and answering all the questions and having more questions as to what's going on and why we do this. And how I realize that it's the Seder meal that has preserved the faith of the Jewish people all these centuries. Because can you imagine the effect upon a family if once a year you are reminded that your people were slaves and were brought out of slavery by Moses and brought into a promised land and another land, even though Moses didn't quite make it, and that you have to identify with the slavery side of humanity and defend their rights, their human rights. I think that's what explains why my connection to the Jewish people is so revered by me, because every year I am reminded of the faith not only in a religion, but the faith in a democracy that we experience through the people of Israel. And it's just mystical. It's a mystic connection. I've been studying for years a famous medieval rabbi, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, who in 1263 in July debated whether the Messiah had appeared, and he won the debate. He actually is the first rabbi in history, I think, that ever won the debate at one of these debates. And the Christians of Spain would then have them debate the rabbis rather than putting them on the rack and try to convert them that way. But what did he say in the debate? He said, the followers of the rabbis would not kill people, of the Messiah would not kill people. There will be peace on earth. This shows you that the Messiah has not appeared yet. The king of Catalonia, of Catalan, which still wants to separate from Spain, I might add, and I sort of admire their ability to be able to do that. He awarded the win of 300 gold pieces to Rabbi Moses ben Nachman for winning the debate, even though they had a convergent, formerly Jewish person who joined the Dominican order and debated the rabbi at the debate and lost the debate. And he, of course, got into trouble for that. How dare he win the debate? And I think this too would be a great story, because I think that he was a physician, if I recall correctly, and I think he and the king had a relationship before the debate, that this physician, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, this is just my imagination working here, could have saved the king's child from some terrible plague for not washing enough around mealtime, as the Jewish people do. And why is it that this rabbi from the Middle Ages, whom Rabbi Lederman introduced me to at his, coming full circle here, at his book review at the Hebrew Educational Alliance so many years ago, reviewed a book called Barcelona and Beyond, when this rabbi debated, and he opened me to this wonderful Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, Nachmanides, not Maimonides. But I thank all those connections in my life, And it's certainly given me plenty of information to reflect upon during the coronavirus. I just want to close with this thought from Gerard Manley Hopkins, the famous Jesuit Victorian poet, who said that the just man justices. And I hope that people who review these antiquated podcasts in years to come will remember that we are all human beings. We have to respect each other's humanity. And as Hopkins says in that wonderful poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, he says, I say more, because each human being is in God's eye what in God's eye he is, another Christ. And Hopkins goes on to say then that Christ is present in whenever we see the face of another human being, it's the face of Christ himself that we see. And that's where I see a connection between Judaism and Christianity here on this issue when it comes to human rights. And I'll hope we'll remember those wonderful words of Hopkins.
Well, Dennis, on behalf of my community and the Jewish community and the Islamic community and the secular as well as Christian communities, I appreciate all the work you have done on human rights and justice issues over the course of your career. And I very much appreciate it, and I hope through these podcasts people will get a better feel for the role that you've played over the course of the last 50 years. That's going to do it for our this podcast of Gallagher's World. Once again, on the screen you see the email and ways to connect and ask Dennis questions if you'd like. And we appreciate you tuning in each week. And Dennis, I'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Clay.